All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our next presentation with the Crossroads exhibit. This is going to be Dr. Rachael Carter and her presentations on rural economic development. Now, Dr. Carter is I'm going to say this right, an economist with Mississippi State University's Extension Services, and she works predominantly in rural studies. All right, so I'm going to let Dr. Carter take over, and I'm so sorry that I butchered that. I tried.
That's okay. Thank you, didn't butcher. Thank you, Christina, for having me. I'm very excited to be part of the Crossroads speaker series. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about rural communities, and I'm kind of following up on your previous speaker, Dr. Green, talked a lot about the dynamics of rural communities. And so I'm going to talk about how they form and how that affects how you can do economic development in a rural area. Okay, these are some things to think about. If you are wanting to do economic development, these are some things to capitalize on and think about in your community: the economic climate of your community, the culture, where do you fit regional plan, what are your policies and regulations, your resources, community needs, your message to other and your brand, and then you have to assess your economic development stakeholders and your staff if you're getting ready to do economic development. This information is adapted from the National League of Cities. Great information and all very correct, but does this really apply to us in rural America? So you kind of have to think about how many of you do have an economic development staff in your community? What are your stakeholders and resources, and are they limited? Where do you fit regionally, or is there a town nearby you even? So it may be a little bit different for rural development in an urban area and in a smaller town. And this is one thing that I did have to learn early on in my career when I was actually trying to help some communities get started with some community economic development. And I learned that things that were didn't necessarily work the same way in the small town. And so there was different strategies that I had to think about. But let's just kind of roll back to the basics. And this is just a photo of a leadership class that I taught in Starkville years and years ago. And so there may be some familiar faces there, but it was a great group. And throughout this presentation, there's just going to be some photos of things that I've seen and things that I liked about community economic development work in Mississippi and the surrounding states. So what is community development? Well, it occurs when a group works collectively, meaning work together, towards a common goal. And it's all about the building of the relationships and those relationships that are formed because you have something in common and you're trying to move forward to meet a need. Community and economic development are not the exact same thing. Economic development is kind of focused on more economic growth, more jobs, more business, more industry, more tax revenue, all good things. But you have to take that in context, where community development is more about the building of the relationships, the structure of the community, the quality of life, the economic security, not necessarily we have more jobs. Well, are these jobs sustainable? Are they going to stay here? Are they going to help people earn a living wage? And then balanced growth. But sometimes you'll see a town that will grow really, really fast, as in the boom towns of Texas. When you have an oil boom, then a lot of times infrastructure needs change really, really fast and things grow, but then you may not have those needs of years down the road if the oil prices change and it becomes a bust town rather than a boom town. So you have to think about how do we build that sense of community as the community grows, so the community and economic work together. This information is from a friend of mine, Dr. Roberto Gallardo, who is at Purdue University, and he kind of defines community economic development as a complex process that helps communities move forward and allows residents to mobilize and build on their assets to move their quality of life in a sustainable way. So let's say it's fine to grow if you want to, but let's do it in a way that's not going to be detrimental to the community, where it's going to be positive growth. So let's say you are coming into a community, you're a consultant, or maybe you're just a resident and you want your community to grow and you want it to develop. So what can you do? In other words, what should you do? Well, you could be the change agent. You know, in a ideal world, you could come in and say, I'm the person that's going to make things happen and make things change. But should you be the change agent? So that's the question that we're going to have to ask ourselves. Are you the person that can make this happen? Do you want to be that person? And should you be that person? Because you have to do it in a different way in a rural community. And so those are some of the questions that we're going to answer with this presentation today. So how can you foster positive community change in a rural community, well, or in any community? So you have to understand the dynamics of that community and how it was formed. And so we're going to kind of drift into the world of rural sociology just a little bit. I'm an economist, so don't don't criticize me too deeply for this, because I don't normally get into deep theoretical topics and things like that. But we are going to talk a little bit about the dynamics of how communities form, especially in rural areas. In rural areas, the communities were formed based on agricultural and natural resources. People moved further west as they were trying to gain access to more and more resources, such as whether that was forestry, fishing, places to plant crops, and that's kind of how society moved west. And people lived and they had to sustain themselves on what was there in the local area. And so you have these two different terms based on how communities form, where some communities turned to factories in the industrial age and became more mechanized, and those societies adapted a little bit differently than those rural societies. And so we have these two theories from Emily Durkheim called mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. And mechanical solidarity is what we have in rural areas, and it describes the communities as they have very strong common core values, very high importance on religion, a very high importance on social norms and rules to keep everybody acting the way that they should. You don't want to upset the fruit basket too much. And then you have, in more urban areas, you have a little more organic solidarity, where maybe change is a little bit easier to adapt to, because the way those societies function is they are very interdependent. Whereas you have restaurants where people dine, and you have people go to jobs, and you have people who have a lot of different tasks at a job, rather than in a rural area, people function more independently. And I listened to the videos from the Smithsonian website, you know, about this, about the exhibit. And one of the people in the video kept talking about, well, in a rural area, it means that you're independent and you can grow your own food and things like that. And that's exactly what this is talking about. So when you think about that, that can kind of help, that kind of impacts how you go about change, because sometimes in a rural area, people are very independent and they're not super excited about somebody from the outside coming in and saying, I'm from the government, or I'm from this organization and I just moved here and I like your town, but I think it needs to be totally different from what it is. And that's automatically going to throw up a lot of barriers, you know, because people sometimes in rural areas don't trust folks from the outside, because a lot of times those decisions have not been very beneficial to them. Just very frankly, you know, decisions can be made from someone that lives in a town far away that doesn't know anything about that community, and then that community's got to figure out how to adapt to those rules and changes. And so sometimes that has a negative impact. So that's something that you've got to think about. So if you come into a community, you've got to think about also the social structure of that community. I mentioned rural areas do have a lot of norms and sometimes can be a little adverse to change and outside ideas. So you have to think about how can these innovations be adopted in a rural area. Rural communities have a class system. You have what's called the power elites, people who are in charge. And you have some unwritten rules about how things are done. I know you've heard that phrase, is this is how we do things here, you know, things like that. And so that's a very real thing. And it's not a bad thing. It's just that's how it is in rural America. I've lived in rural communities pretty much my entire life. And so you have to understand that to go into a community. You have to say, okay, well, how am I going to have these positive changes happen in a rural community? And one of the ways to go about that is to communicate with those power elites and let them know why these changes are good and good for them, and let those people maybe help help those things happen. So sometimes you can have things, an insider, if you have a champion, a local champion, a lot of times those are the ways that you can have rural economic development happen a little faster and be more accepted. I talked about how it's very important to how the community interacts and the values and surroundings. Sometimes it's very good to, if you're wanting to have community economic development or have positive change in a community, maybe have people buy into healthy eating habits or something like that, then that would be, you know, you want to figure out, okay, well, what are the groups in the community that would be impacted by this, and what are the groups that people trust, and how do we get those people to actually champion. All throughout this presentation, I do have some different photographs and things because you never know what you're going to find in a rural area and how people network and people pass through. And I was visiting with a lady in a rural town in Mississippi, and I was talking about something to do with an organization and saying, oh, well, maybe this organization should use Robert's Rules of Order. And I'm an economist. I'm not a you know, administrative person, but I've heard of Robert's Rules of Order. And she was like, oh, my grandfather knew Robert. Like, really? And so she went to the cabinet and pulled out a signed copy of Robert's Rules of Order. So you just really never know what you're going to come across in a rural area. So that's something to think about. Is there a lot of valuable hidden assets in rural areas that, and there's a unique spirit because there's got to be some reason why people live there, why they choose to stay in a rural community, and because they're wonderful and they have a lot of just wonderful things that can be celebrated. And so that brings us to kind of the next tool to think about in a community, a rural community development. You have to think about, well, what is the sense of place of this community? Why do people live here? Why does this community form? What's important in this community? What is the culture of the community? Is it an artistic community? Is it an agricultural community? What are the talents of the local population? Is there a way that you can celebrate this? And is it a resource? And the photo kind of in the background, that's of right across the road from some family land in Mississippi County. And I just think that's a very beautiful farm road, farm scene. And that's something that could be capitalized in, and just people just experiencing the picturesqueness of the rural areas. And so that's something that I consider an asset and a resource that we have here. So if you want to be the change agent in a community and have successful community economic development, these are some things that you can kind of put in your toolbox. You've got to understand the values of the community. What is important to the community? That's something that local elected officials are very good at, is they understand the community. They know what's important to their people. And so, and that is their job, is to represent those people when decisions are made. So you've got to understand the values of the community. Identify a common interest or a common goal with a group. So, and then determine the process or the issue. Why are you not achieving what you want to achieve with this goal? For example, I talked about healthy eating habits. Well, why is this community not eating healthy? Why are you not satisfied with the status quo of what's going on? And what are the barriers to people eating healthy? Is it that they don't have access to healthy food? Do they not know how to cook it? Can they not afford it? Does it taste bad? I mean, what are those barriers? So you have to think about that, and then identify a group of people that can help address that issue and have the resources that you need in order to address that barrier. And then determine your strategy. How are we going to do this? Sometimes it's very good to have a person that is a change agent. Sometimes policymakers can be change agents, but sometimes it's very hard for them to do so. And this is why in a rural area, policymakers are busy responding to problems. They do not have a huge staff in a rural community. They have limited budgets. They're very faced with limited resources. So sometimes it's up to a volunteer or concerned citizen to do community economic development. They have to deal with the distrust of outsiders. Their constituents may be distrusting the outsiders. The outsiders may be distrusting the insiders. They've got to handle all of that. Then they're also tasked with applying federal or state policies that have been developed by outsiders, most likely, and figuring out how to adapt them to their local community so that they're in compliance with federal and state laws. And so that's another big challenge, because they've got to figure out what those are, and then how do we adapt them? Do we have the resources to even adapt these changes? And then you've got the communities that are faced with the fear of change. You know, are these changes going to be good for me, or are they going to be bad for me? I'm doing okay now. Is this going to change that? And then staffing shortages, I mentioned that already. And then value conflicts, because everybody's from the same place doesn't mean that the same things are important to everybody else. So you have differing values. And so you have to find that common ground in order to move forward, and groups of people that have similar values. There are a lot of different strategies. These are just some more tools in the toolbox for doing economic development in a rural area. You have capacity development, where basically you go in and you build the skills and the talents of the local population. You build that capacity. We talk about, a lot of times I do rural tourism work, we talk about building capacity in rural tourism. So the Tanglefoot Trail that goes from Houston, Mississippi to New Albany, Mississippi, that was a great capacity building economic development example, because they created a mechanism for bikes to travel up and down through these communities. Education is another tool, you know, putting out infomercials, or campaign strategy, where you kind of just flood people with as much positive information about what you think is a great idea. Network exchange, and that's kind of basically how different groups communicate with each other. Conflict resolution. We talked about not everybody's going to have the same values, so you have to kind of know how to do a little bit of that. And then issue-based community development, which is something that I use a lot, because if you have issue-based community development, you have people who care about what is going on. They have that common value or goal. So if people are interested in the issue, then they're going to be more likely to contribute their assets and talents and resources to solving problems. These are some other things that are vital to success, especially when you're doing that issue-based community development. You've got to have a local community catalyst. You got to have somebody in the local area that's going to be responsible for making sure that you achieve the day-to-day activities and goals and success. You've got to have access to resources and opportunity, and that's all about inviting the right people to the table, the right people to your team. You've got to build relationships amongst these different team members and people who have access to different assets. And then you have to have public-private partnerships, and that's something that I've found of Mississippi Main Street communities, is it's not enough just to throw federal grant dollars or state grant dollars at a problem. You've got to have public investment and private investment, whether it's financial or whether it's the relationships and other assets and resources. You've got to have those linkages and relationships in order for development to be sustainable, because if you just throw money at the problem, it's going to work until the money runs out, and then you've got to start all over. And then also knowing your market, knowing the values of your community, knowing what they want, knowing what they need. So if you are in a rural community and you are kind of giving some thought to community economic development, think about, how do you fit into the regional economy? What skills and strengths does your community have compared to the communities that are 5, 10, 15, 20 miles from you? Do you all have the same strengths? Do you have a niche for maybe the healthcare sector or the furniture sector? Or are you a little bit different? Do you have different resources and needs? And then how can you work with your surrounding communities? If you don't have the exact same skills and talents as in your community as the neighboring community, how can you balance each other out? Or if you have some of the same skills and talents, how are you going to use that to maybe as a big recruiting tool and to grow that entire sector? To determine this, kind of how you fit in a community and what you may need, you definitely need to spend a little time gathering data. You can, as I said right here, there are millions of ways to gather data and determine needs. I do a lot of needs assessment work. You can do it with a focus group, small group of people that you think might be interested. For example, you want to start a farmer's market. You may have 3 focus group meetings with people that are interested in farmer's markets or horticulture or small business development. You may do some surveys. Hey, would you shop at the farmer's market? Do you have enough money to spend at the farmer's market? And those kind of things. You may look at existing data and reports, and you may go to the Census Bureau. That's why it's so important for everybody to fill out the census information, so we have good existing data. Economic studies, market analysis studies, business inventory studies, those are all just examples of ways to gather data. And so if you are doing community economic development work and you need help with figuring out, okay, well, where do I even start? I don't even know what data means. Give us a call at Mississippi State University Extension Center for Government and Community Development. We will be happy to help you sort out what kind of data you do need and where you can find it. Think about data as it's got to be accurate. It needs to be correct. Sometimes existing data is big picture data, and that you may have some things change from day to day that existing data doesn't depict. So you have to, and then there's also humans compiling existing data. So it could be wrong. Just so if it doesn't make sense. So when you raise your hand and ask a question and think, okay, why is this not accurate? What's going on with this? Is this really right? And sometimes it is, but sometimes you have to dig a little deeper. And then also you have to say, am I getting the right data? Is it helping me make good decisions? Is it helping me determine my resources? Is it helping me find opportunities? Is it helping me identify strengths? Is it helping me reach my goals and figure out what those goals need to be? The picture here in this photo, I love this one. It's a little dated, but it's in a community in Mississippi that we did some work in a few years ago. And what I love about this is because this shows teamwork. In this picture, you have somebody who works with the Main Street Association. You have an elected official from the city. You have an elected official from the county. They're both in the same picture, and they're standing side by side wanting to work together. And then you have a small business owner. And so I thought that was so great that all of these folks were like, hey, we're here, we're ready. Our goal is we want to move our community forward and put our own goals, you know, personal goals aside, because we want to do what's good for our town. And so, and then everybody's going to benefit. So I love that, because it was all about building relationships with that. We're going to kind of going back to been talking a lot about these issue-based community economic development process. This is just kind of a roadmap to doing economic development when it's issue-based development. You identify your needs, identify the community values. How do those community values and needs match up with the resources that you have access to? Then you have to set some goals, big goals of what you need to address those needs, come up with some strategies, which are basically steps to achieving the goals, and then you celebrate success. So that really kind of sums up the whole issue-based community development strategic planning process, just that one slide right there. Here is kind of a quick way to determine what your community needs are and do it in a positive way in a community. This came from Dr. Laura Garkovich with the University of Kentucky at the time of this. I'm not sure if that's where she is today, but that is where she was at the time that, that she put this out. You go into your group and you ask the community, what do we want to preserve in our community? What do we want to improve, and then what do we want to change? And this is a quick way to identify your assets and resources, because when you say, what do you want to preserve, that gives some light to the group's values. It gives some light to the group's assets and their resources. What do you want to improve? That kind of helps you figure out, okay, well, what are we doing right? What can we build on? And then what do we need to change? And that's a way to go ahead and do a very quick needs assessment. And then you can very quickly see how these things all line up together. The picture here is one of my favorite people that I get to do community economic development work with. This is Ann Tackett, and she's in Aberdeen, Mississippi, and she knows how to get things done in her community. And that cooler right there that she is showing me, she's very excited about it. That's from a grant that we have gotten in the recent months, and that's to improve access to local foods in the community. And one of the things that we're doing with that is we're adding cooler space to the farmers market so that farmers can provide things that have to have cold storage at the market, because they were very limited, as it had to be things that could be out in the outdoors or even in their building, which could get kind of hot. I mean, July in Aberdeen, Mississippi, it's pretty hot. So you don't really want a lot of food products sitting out in the sun for extended periods of time. So this is a way to keep things cool so they can add some diversity to that market. This slide, we're getting kind of close to the end of the presentation, but I kind of wanted to show you the other thing that you've got to do to figure out who needs to be on your team is you've got to think about who should your stakeholders and your partners be? And a stakeholder is anybody who has something to gain or something to lose, whether you're successful or not with what you're trying to achieve. And so if you ask yourself that question, okay, well, who has something to gain if we are able to provide access to healthy foods, then you can kind of identify who your potential team members might be. These circles actually just represent community fields, which are just groups of people in a community that people may belong to. You may have elected officials there at the bottom. You may have the local media. You have your families in your community. You have your industry. You may have local restaurants, community organizations. There's millions of different community field groups, but all these people, when they work together and build relationships outside these community fields, outside each circle, then you have a successful community. We have already talked about this, but kind of basically, this is still talking a little bit about the issue-based community development, where you have to have a vision, you have to gather data with research, you have to have a plan and a team, you have to have a plan for taking action, and then you have to have some accountability, celebrate your success. And these are just the steps to taking action. You build a team of stakeholders. You determine what kind of action steps you have to take, determine the steps and the goals. Remember, baby steps are very good, because what are rural community people sometimes opposed to is radical change. Baby steps are good. So, and then a lot of times when you do have those baby steps and you're successful, you need to communicate those to the community. And then what's going to happen? People are going to get mad when they see you out there. Whether the change is successful or not, people are going to get mad and be like, oh, wow, I have this idea, I have that idea. And that is the point when you invite more people to your table and say, oh, well, you would like to, you think we did this wrong. Well, how should we do it? And invite them to participate. So communication is very important as well. And then you have to stay organized. And this is why I'm a supporter of Main Street, is because that person's job is community economic development in their rural community, and so they can provide a stable function, and anybody can do that, but it's often very good if you have somebody that is designated that is their position to move that rural community forward. And so that's why Main Streets can be a good thing. We've talked about this a little bit, but these are the strategies. I was talking about how strategies are just a way to move you towards your goal. In a strategy, you have to identify who is going to participate, who is the stakeholders, anyone who has something to gain or lose, what are they going to do, when are they going to do it, that's the date and the time the goal will be achieved, how are they going to do it, what resources do you need, what people need to be involved, do you have the money to do it, do you have the time to do it, and then going back to what I talked about before, is you've got to have some organizational structure. You've got to have somebody that can hold everybody accountable. The next thing to think about when you're doing rural development, I talked a little bit earlier about economic policies and procedures, and sometimes federal policies and state policies have to be adopted at the local level. It's very important when you're getting ready to move forward with community and economic development in a small town, is you got to know your policies. Are your policies beneficial or prohibitive? Can you change these policies, or are they part of state or federal law? And then that becomes a much bigger thing to deal with, is you may not be able to change those policies. And then do you have the authority to make these changes? If you have the authority, if you believe that you have the authority, then you need to say, okay, well, what is the code section that says that I have the authority? So you need to kind of get your ducks in a row and figure that out before you start moving forward, because you don't want to inadvertently break a law policy and then get your hand slapped, and that kind of sets you back and sets a bad light on what you're trying to do. Evaluate your policies in your community, and remember that not all development is good. So you have to say, is this going to be good for our community or not? And this is an important question to ask. These are some more of my leadership students that I had several years ago. Do I have the authority to do this? What is the code section? That's the takeaway from that previous slide. We're going to talk a little bit about strategies for success. Is you've got to determine what your resources are and leverage them. And I talked earlier about the Tanglefoot Trail. There's a scene from that. They had a resource of a rail bed that had not been used in many years, and so they had access to that resource. Not every community is going to have that, so you've got to figure out how to leverage what you do have. You got to identify your resources and your stakeholders, and I'm kind of reiterating and pulling together what I've talked about earlier. You've got to identify your social structure. Who are your movers and shakers in your town? Who kind of makes those decisions behind the scenes? Get them on your team. What are the community fields or the groups in your community that people belong to? What is going to be the common goal or interest that you're going to address? And then you need to create an outlet for inclusion. And as I said, if you announce your success and people say, oh, why didn't you invite me? Say, now I am. So kind of definitely create mechanisms for inclusion. And I talked about this already as well, getting stakeholders to the table. That's why issue-based community development works very well in rural communities, is because people have to have a reason to participate. You have to be doing something that they're passionate about, or they're not going to dedicate their limited time and resources to your cause. So think about what opportunities exist in your town. And that's another fun photo from the past where we had a group where we were trying to do community economic development work, and we wanted them to kind of form a team. And so we had them work with a chef to actually prepare a meal together, and everybody had a different part that they had to do, and nobody there was really that much of a cook except for the lady there on the left, and you can see that she's grilling the chef. So you have to, that was kind of a way to get people to work together and learn how to just figure out what each other's talents were. Just some things that you can do in a small community just to kind of get things moving. Support your small businesses, especially now. Work to retain your industries, visiting with those industries saying, hey, how are you doing? What can we do to help? This is if you're like a Chamber of Commerce Economic Development organization, do you need us to help find a mechanism to train your employees? What's going on? Evaluate if you're too dependent on any one industry. And if you are, what can you do about it? Leadership. I showed all these pictures of leadership groups. Leadership classes are great because they teach people to use those skills for community and economic development if they're done right. And so that's very important that you have people have the skills to step up and be a leader and do conflict resolution and identify their assets and strengths and create action plans. You can take issue-based action, which we spent a lot of time thinking about that. Also, you can just clean up your community, get a group together and pick up the trash and do what you can just to make it look as nice as possible. Other things that you can do is a lot of times I tell communities in groups, if you have a big group together, go to these different sites that travelers or people even in your local community use to say, okay, gosh, what am I going to get for supper tonight? So they go to Facebook or they go to TripAdvisor or they go to Yelp or somewhere like that to see what's out there. Pull up your own community and see what is listed on these sites. And if some of the restaurants and businesses that are great are not up there, go talk to them and say, hey, let me help get you online. And so that people can find you. And then it doesn't cost you a thing to go through as many of these social media sites as you can find and give positive reviews for your local businesses. So that's a great way just to move a step in the right direction. You can also conduct a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats path. Think about where you're positioned in your community, as I talked about that. Can you provide an opportunity to those in a nearby larger town? Can you create, are you a good location for maybe some tier industries or businesses and things like that? Are you on a transportation path? Do a lot of people pass through your town on the way to another town for some reason? Can you become a destination for something? That is a church in a very rural community, and I've always thought it'd be a great idea to promote rural church tours because we have such beautiful old churches all throughout our state. So I just thought that was a very beautiful picture. Think about who is not involved and get those people to the table. Tupelo, Mississippi does a fantastic job at getting people from different groups involved and engaged. So that's what this is a picture of, doing some strategic planning up in Tupelo a couple of years ago. So if people are not involved, ask them to be involved. These are also some steps for promoting positive change. You have to think about what the regulations are. We talked about that. Think about education. Think about incentives. Why would people want to participate and make changes? Think about the partners that you can bring to the table. Think about voluntary initiatives, cooperate with your neighbors, and be radically inclusive. And this photo over here on the right is West Point, Mississippi. West Point is a really fun town, and they have worked very hard on downtown revitalization and just revitalization overall in the past 10 years. And so it just makes me happy to see what's going on in West Point. And so that's pictures from the farmers market. So they'll open up sometime in the spring. So I encourage you to take a visit. Circling back, this is kind of the end of the presentation, but to have rural community economic development, you've got to identify the issues. Go back to the PIC model. What are we going to preserve, improve, and change? Why have things not been successful in the past? You have to ask yourself that question. Why is this a problem? And is it a priority and something that you need to change in your community? This is just a little bit of an example of trying to decide, okay, how are we going to increase sponsorship for a farmer's market? Who would suffer a loss if your farmer's market is not a success? Think about all those groups. Those are your stakeholders. You say you want to start a local food event. Well, who has something to gain from a local food event? Would it be the small businesses? Would it be the city? Who would benefit from a local food event? And that kind of helps you identify those stakeholders. And there's the diagram one more time where you can kind of see where all the different community fields can work together for a successful community. So what do you want to tell the world about your town? All right, that is all that I have this evening. Let's stop the share. Thank you so much, Christina, for having me be a part of this.
Thank you so much for presenting. I really do appreciate it. And thank you. Thank you. You have no idea how much I appreciate it.
Absolutely welcome.
All right, so then I guess I will go ahead and